I'm glad to see you here today. I'm glad to have you join us for what is going to be a very interesting presentation by Richard Kahn. And he is a retired internist who has been practicing in Maine. He is the author of a book called Diseases in the District of Maine, 1772 to 1820, the unpublished work of Jeremiah Barker, a rural physician in New England. His interest in medical history started when he was in medical school, and that interest has continued for 40 plus years, writing and teaching students and residents, medical societies, and the public. He has, for the past 4 decades, in one capacity or another, been associated with the American Association of the History of Medicine and the American Osler Society, serving as their president. And he and his wife of 60 years, Patty, who is a retired medical librarian, have been living in Mid-Coast, Maine. We're very lucky to have him join us today. He was generous enough to volunteer to give us a talk, and then he sent me an entire menu of opportunities for talks and I'm glad to hear from him today on this. With that, Richie, take it away.
Thank you, Dale. Noah Webster, Proto Epidemiologist, Pedant Pestilence in Politics. He was an educator. He was a little bit pedantic too, a little bit arrogant, but anyway. But Pestilence in Politics, and most of us think of it as Webster's dictionary, and we'll get to that a little bit. But we're talking tonight about these two books, a collection of papers on bilious fever, that's yellow fever, 1796, and a brief history of epidemic and pestilential disease, 1799. It's not so brief. Okay. And the missing author's review copy, about 1832. This was lost in the bowels of New York Public Library. So I'm Richard Kahn. I'm a 57th year internal medicine resident, a slow learner. I just came across this picture a little while ago, and it just reminds me how far we've come. That's Index Medicus behind us. They stopped printing that in 2004, and it was replaced by Medline. And, you know, going back through each of those volumes, it was really something. The plan for tonight's discussion, I'll with a brief introduction, and then I'm going to talk about how Webster instigated the first medical journal in the United States, the Medical Repository, 1797. And the publication of 2 books and 25 letters on epidemic and pestilential disease. The focus will be on the brief history of epidemic and pestilential disease, 1799, why, how, and where he gathered his medical and epidemiologic data, the content, authority, criticism, and influence of Webster's medical books, and this rediscovery of that revision copy. And then I'll just a few conclusions. We know Webster was a dictionary. He wrote dictionaries. He was a lexicographer. In the words of the definition of Sam Johnson in 1755, a lexicographer is a writer of dictionary, a harmless drudge that busies himself with tracing the origins and detailing significant words, the signification of words. Well, he certainly did that. He taught himself 26 languages to do the etymology. So that's what most of that dictionary work happened after 1800. Webster was born in Hartford, Connecticut in 1758. He came from a family of limited financial means. They weren't poor, but his father had to mortgage their 90-acre farm to pay for his Yale college expenses. He graduated Yale in 1778, the middle of the Revolution. In 1783, the same year as the Treaty of Paris was signed, ending the American Revolution, he published a speller. It was part of a system of language. People were coming from all over the world to come to this new country, and he felt there should be a language that they had in common and pronounce things pretty much the same. He also wanted to sell books. And I might mention, before 1820, it was difficult to earn a living writing. There were only 2 people, I came across this several places, Noah Webster and Jedediah Morse in geography, that pretty much earned a living writing books, but they were school textbooks. In 1789, Webster, after helping get the the Constitution passed, ratified, he said we have to have a national language, a national government. If we don't respect ourselves, nobody else is going to respect us. And he was involved with the Federalist Party. He was a spokesman sort of for the Federalist Party. It's the first political party in the United States. Young country, Alexander Hamilton led it. And they, the Federalists, attracted support from business leaders, encouraged a strong national government and federalism. They also were interested in shipping, and that's in this talk with epidemiology and quarantine, that's very important. So 1789 was also the year that he married and subsequently fathered 8 children. So he really had to sell some books also, because he doesn't come from money. So the spelling book 1783 was part of a system, the Grammatical Institute, spelling book, grammar, and reader. And not only did he sell books, but he'd also, it gave him name recognition. Almost everybody knew his name. Anybody that had a child or grandchild or whatever, there was a Webster speller floating around. In fact, not only people, it looks like the mice even enjoyed his speller. While at college, while at Yale, he read Francis Bacon, John Locke, Isaac Newton, and he had a lifelong interest in science and medicine. His medical life, most of what we'll be talking about, is 1795 to 1800. He was a freelance intellectual. There were no epidemiologists, but he was interested in this epidemiology and public health. He considered yellow fever to be a domestic problem. He didn't mean that quarantine was useless, but you could do a lot more good if you cleaned up the city. You'd have fewer sufferers, fewer people die if you cleaned up the cities, rather than really focus just on ships. Quarantine didn't seem to be working very well. And I argue that his letters and publications influenced Benjamin Rush and others. The 10-year-old republic was under siege during the 1790s, not by a foreign power, but rather by the yearly epidemics of bilious or yellow fever that was poorly understood by physicians, politicians, and the public, and it reflected poorly on this young country. Why would you want to send your kids or invest in this country if every summer the major port cities were closing down? There was a lot of controversy about the benefits and harms of quarantine. So there you can see this, there's lists of the yellow fever epidemics. There were yellow fever epidemics before the 1790s, but in the 1790s, they increased tenfold. Why? I think it had to do increased shipping, post-independence, trade expansion, French Revolutionary War. We were intermittently neutral, and so they were transshipping and things like that. But shipping was up somewhere between 200% and 400% during the 1790s. I also wonder whether there was the major cities, Boston, New York, Philadelphia, had an increased population of 25 to 35%. And I just wonder whether there was an in-migration of people who are immunologically naive to yellow fever. Yellow fever generally gives lifelong immunity. So that may have also added to these epidemics. But let's go to 1795, New York City, and that's where Webster was at the time. Yellow fever had just attacked the city. There were no US medical journals. And Webster said, if we're going to have a successful country, we can't have this. And what he did, he sent this circular. I don't expect that you can read it. He sent this circular up and down the coast to physicians, asking them, tell me what's going on in your area, and I will publish it. And maybe the faculty, the physicians, can make sense out of it and stop these epidemics. So that was the circular, October 31st, 1795. And he did publish it in 1796, publish all the papers and his comments. In the front material, so date is July 1st, front material of that book, he said, I've been solicited to advertise for more, do this again, have another year, get more papers. But he says, I have neither the inclination nor the leisure to devote time to this object. He's trying to earn a living. Nor am I convinced that it will reward a continuance of my labors. Well, 6 weeks later, Elihu Hubbard Smith, a fellow Connecticut Yalie who subsequently studied medicine under Benjamin Rush in Philadelphia and came to New York in 1793. And he was a neighbor of Webster on Pine Street. And he wrote in his diary, there's an extensive diary that's been transcribed, I think as Mr. Webster has relinquished his plan of continuing his collection, of taking up myself. Because Webster had just July 1st, he said, I'm not going to continue this. Well, just 8 days after Webster's book, it's not exactly 8 days, but I mean the date on the book. So July 9th, Smith wrote in his diary a sketch of the principal objects of a proposed periodical to be called a medical repository. And the main goal would be to collect facts, opinions, reasoning having to do with epidemic and endemic disease in the United States, especially febrile disease. Those are his words in the diary. But he was talking about diseases in addition to yellow fever. And in fact, he had 14 other items he was going to add in this new journal to be. 4 months after Webster's book, November 11th, I found a prospectus for the medical repository signed by Dr. Samuel Latham Mitchell. He was a professor of chemistry, botany, and several other things at Columbia College, which had been King's College before the Revolution. Edward Miller was an educator and physician, and Elihu Hubbard Smith, mentioned a little while ago. And they wrote, the partial success of the late benevolent attempt of Webster's bilious fever of the kind now referred to is rather encouraging than disheartening, since, and this is paraphrasing, the failure of Webster's book as a continuing enterprise, remember he said he wasn't going to continue it, it was due to external factors unrelated to design. Achieving success for such a publication requires a significant time and collaboration. Now there are 3 physician editors instead of just Webster. And the scope of Webster's inquiry was relatively narrow. It was yellow fever. They were going to expand it. So a year from the publication of Webster's book and numerous visits, I mean, Smith and Webster, I counted at least 81 times that they met. They discussed things. So this is the medical repository, July of 1797. These are the first 4 issues. And it lasted for 27 years. It was a quarterly. It's the first medical repository, was the first serious attempt in the United States to present the relation between science and medical practice in a serial format. And I think this is really important, that allowed response and communication. Because before this, if you were a doctor and you wanted to get something out to have people know about some disease, you could put it in a magazine or newspaper. But the idea of going back and forth with your physicians, I'm not sure everybody in the newspaper who was getting newspaper wanted to read that. But that's what this was. This was a medical journal. Not surprisingly, Noah Webster was one of the first 266 subscribers to the journal. And on the left, I just point out that on Pine Street, there's Webster, 25 Pine Street, and Smith is at 45. They were neighbors. But not everybody was enthusiastic about Webster's circular of October 31st, 1795, and his foray into epidemiology. His circular was requesting the reports, was published in the Philadelphia newspaper, the Aurora General Advertiser, on November 4th, 1795. So a few days after, the date on his circular. And it was published November 4th. That paper was edited by Benjamin Franklin Bach, and he was the grandson of Ben Franklin and a staunch anti-federalist. So that was November 4th. They printed the circular. 2 days later, Bach published a nasty, cynical, sarcastic article to Noah Webster, author and physician general of the United States. It is to be deplored, sapient sir, that a calamity so dreadful as yellow fever ravaging the United States. And it's equally deplored that not a physician, no one else is interested other than you. It was really pretty nasty. Well, 4 days after that, both the circular and boxed nasty comments were published in the Argus. This is a New York newspaper, and Thomas Green, or Greenleaf's newspaper, he was also an anti-federalist. So on the left, there's something that Webster sent into them. He said, "You omitted my letter to the physicians for several times for want of room. There was no room. But once you had the nasty article by Bach from that newspaper, you published both." So then the editor says, this is the editor of the Argus in New York, "Thank thee, Noah Webster Jr., self-dubbed Esquire, for the dull, pedantic impertinence contrained," that's what it gets a in the proceedings. So you can see, I think this was more a political rather than medical opposition. Certainly there was also medical opposition. So that book, Webster's first book, Bilious Collection of Papers on Bilious Fever, had 9 papers. 2 appeared to be contagious. That was where quarantine might be helpful. It's the ships bringing in the disease. 5 were anti-contagious, encouraging public health issues, clean up the cities. That will do more good than quarantine. And 2, it wasn't clear. And from ancient times, physicians generally agreed on only one point regarding epidemics. And don't excuse my Latin, but I looked it up. It's either Cheeto, Shito, or Cito. In 3 different places, I looked it up to pronounce it. Cito, longe, tarde. Leave quickly, go far away, and return late. That was the only thing that there was a general agreement if there was an epidemic coming to town. It wasn't too helpful for the poor. They didn't have the option of going to their relatives out in rural areas or going, they were sort of stuck, and Webster talks about that. The following year, 1797, Dr. William Curry in Philadelphia, he was a well-known physician, author, member of the American Philosophical Society, the College of Physicians. He published 3 letters stating that yellow fever is a contagious disease. Webster responded by publishing 25 letters to Curry. He challenged Curry's opinion, and each letter was read by Smith before it was published. And I'll only read this one paragraph from letter 19, December. Tracing our epidemics to some distant region, the Greeks and Romans blame the plague on God, the Mohammedans ascribe it to fate, the Americans charge it to the West Indies, the English blame Egypt, French blame Constantinople or Smyrna, and the West Indies coast of Africa. Well, a little presentism here. We can look at it from the 21st century and say, weren't they talking about different epidemics? Well, almost certainly. But one, they weren't so careful about, we had to give it a name, that the other was that many people felt that many of the epidemics were the same disease. They varied by geography and topography of different areas. So that was not really so strange. Well, while these letters were, while Webster was publishing these letters, Benjamin Rush wrote to Webster, and he said, "I had great satisfaction reading your letters to Curry. It made a great impression on our citizens. You need to publish it as a book." And other physicians also recommended to Webster that he publish it as a book. Well, he did some more research. He added a 70-page addendum, and in December 1799, he published his 700-page 2-volume, a brief, not so brief, history of epidemic and pestilential diseases. I can't go through all of this, obviously, but I'll just pick out a few. This is the tables of contents, a diversity of opinions respecting the cause and origin of the pestilence. Of pestilence in general. Historical view of pestilential epidemic from 1788 to 1799 when he published a book. That's where he could do a little bit more. He could do some contact tracing, and he did. A second volume, Bills of Mortality, tables of bills of mortality of the last 2 centuries with principal phenomena of elements. He was trying to relate why is one year a bad year, trying to make sense. And he wasn't the only one trying to do this. And he has these tables showing the deaths and different diseases they were having, and volcanoes and volcanoes and earthquakes and different comets that were happening, and could they be related? This section 15, the phenomena which attended pestilential periods and conjectures regarding causes. And he says, we're not sure. We are to admit with great caution the influence of the planets, of all this meteorology on diseases that seem to afflict mankind. It is an influence very uncertain and undefinable. I'll talk about contagion infection a little bit later. And then I just want to point out that he has a section in the addendum, 3 pages on venesection. He generally did not talk about therapy. So 700 pages, almost nothing on therapy. It was cause and prevention of diseases, of epidemics, but not therapy. And just semi-incidentally, he did not believe venesection, bloodletting worked, and his medical friends couldn't convince him otherwise. And the last thing I'm just going to mention here is vapor or mephitic air. I don't know how many of you know the term mephitic, but it's not too commonly used, and you can look things up like this. It was used much more commonly 250 years ago, but fast 150, 200, it wasn't used very much. It's mephitic refers to noxious, suffocating vapor or pestilential or foul exhalation from the earth. Mephitis or Mephitis, again, I've seen different pronunciations, was a Roman goddess associated with poisonous gases. She was a minor goddess of foul-smelling gases emitted from the ground, particularly volcanic vapors or in swamps. The word Mephitis means stink or foul vapor. And I just think she must have had a hard time in high school, I would think. Anyway, so think of volcanoes and think of those suffocating vapors. And I'm going to tell you about Webster's experiment. So yellow fever is in New York now. On 30th of August, 1795, just after pestilential fever appeared in New York, 2 men fell victim. They died they fell victim to the vapor in a well belonging to a brewery on Pine Street, within a few yards of Webster's house. The well was 25 to 30 feet deep. It contained a few feet of water and had been unused and covered with boards for months. He then wrote, it was so full of mephitic vapor, and this is his experiment, that he put a candle on a string, dropped it down. The candle was extinguished within 8 feet of the surface of the earth, as Webster, found by experiment. And then he said, this was during the sickness, and a question arises whether these 2 things are connected in cause. And now, again, of presentism, things that they didn't, well, actually, this they did know a little bit. CO2 is released from decaying organic material in the water. CO2, by carbon dioxide, is more dense than oxygen. It displaces the oxygen, also increases the carbon dioxide, and these 2 men probably died of hypoxia. Didn't have enough oxygen. But Webster added, he was aware that gases, quote, well known to every chemist, will account for the damps. Damps is an old term, also vapor gas of a noxious kind, in wells, as this fixed air. This is what Webster writes, and I wrote, it's the old term for carbon dioxide, is called in popular language. So he knew something about chemistry, and maybe that's what this whole thing was, but maybe it had to do with this epidemic. He had, as they say, all these tables of mortality and weather and bills associated with bills of mortality in small and large cities in the United States and the rest of the world. But he said you have to be careful. Bills of mortality do not exhibit a complete view of epidemics. For example, if you tried to compare Philadelphia and New York, Philadelphia keeps its data from August to August and New York from January to January. So you just have to be careful. Where did Webster gather the data for his book? He wrote that he went to the libraries of Yale and Harvard College, the Loganian Library in Philadelphia, and the Public Library in New York. That got me for a little while. Public Library in New York in 1790s. Anyway, so on your left is Yale, where his alma mater, and that is Ezra Stiles, the president, and he was also interested in science, and electricity. He was a friend of Benjamin Franklin. In fact, Franklin sent some electrical apparatus for teaching to Yale and I think also to Harvard. But anyway, I might just mention here, so Webster gets into electricity. You know how we go through periods. Right now it's AI. Everything is AI. We went through an autoimmune period in medicine. Everything, if we can get that under control, that will take care. Genetics was, and CRISPR, and we've got all of these things are going to do, and we have cycles. Then it comes down to a more reasonable place. Anyway, electricity was really in the 1780s, 1790s. So he went to Harvard College. Harvard had more books than the other colleges, but not much at all on science and medicine. He may have had better luck at the Loganian Library in Philadelphia. That started in 1754, became part of the library company in Philadelphia in 1792. And James Logan's younger brother, William, and his uncle, who was also William, who was a Bristol, UK physician, they had died, and they donated their 1,300 volume medical library to this library. And Edwin Wolfe felt it may have been the best medical library in North America at the time. But then I said he used the public, he used the public, and this is quote, public library in New York. Well, as I knew that New York Public Library was chartered in 1895. It didn't open until 1911. Couldn't have been that one. But I found the New York Society Library that started, it's extant, but started in 1754 and was in the upper, that building where the arrow, that room where the arrow is, upstairs in the old City Hall from 1754 until 1795. But that's old City Hall became the federal building. It was remodeled in 1788 by Pierre Lafont. You know, we know him for his city plan of Washington, D.C. But so upstairs, that's where the library in that room. And so that was the U.S. Capitol from 1785 to 90. So that was sort of the Library of Congress, I guess. So, but in 1795, it moved a couple blocks down Nassau Street, just behind Pine Street, within 100 yards of where Webster lived. So he used that library also. He complains that no man in this country can find all the books necessary for a complete examination of a historical or scientific subject. He requested epidemiologic data from medical and non-medical correspondents. What about the content of a brief history? Analysis of, I'm just going to touch it. Analysis of the diverse opinions of earlier writers, a chronological historical view of the epidemics, plagues, and other national disasters from Book of Moses to 1799. And again, that last section, 1788 to 99, he could do some original investigation. He deposed some people. And he actually changed what he had written in 1796 in his 1799 book, because he deposed some people and he found that he detected errors. He said, he wrote that I am led to question every fact that does not come from the persons concerned in the transaction related. But if we talk about epidemic constitution versus contagion, why was, again, 1 year a bad? The epidemic constitution was a grouping of atmospheric conditions, local circumstances, seasons, meteorological variation that stressed, that may have determined the rise and fall of epidemic disease. It was combined with infection or contagion a little bit, some local influences, pollution, and that sort of thing. But epidemic constitution was biggie. 90 years ago, CEA Winslow was the first professor of public health at Yale. He wrote that the epidemic constitution was an abstract theoretical concept having no tangible, measurable properties, hence insusceptible to scientific analysis or experimental proof or disproof. Well, certainly Webster wouldn't have been able to do that anyway, but that's what they were trying to do, figure out, trying to make sense out of these. Now, contagion, on the other hand, and if somebody's interested, Margaret DeLacy's 2 books on contagionism in Britain is wonderful. Contagion, there's some poison, either chemical or biological. And I believe more people felt it was chemical than it was biological, transmitted from person to person or by means of an inanimate object. In that case, quarantine might be helpful. So do the epidemics arise from local causes, or are they results introduced from without? historian Marty Pernick posed a political debate succinctly. Was it the dirty streets or the dirty foreigners that caused yellow fever epidemics? Section 16 of contagion infection, and sort of framing disease that Charles Rosenberg, I think, first coined that term in 1992. Disease is a complex entity shaped by biological, social, and cultural factors. Again, trying to make sense. People knew that smallpox was contagious, that one person could give it to another, and quarantine seemed to help if you kept people away from. But if you say this is a contagious disease too, the seasonal timing of yellow fever epidemics suggested that weather and climate played a role, and it did. It was unlike contagion of smallpox and measles, which maybe a little bit, but it didn't close down with the first frost. So Webster's defined things. So he defined specific contagion as the consistent transmission of disease from an affected to a healthy body, independent of season, weather, or location. It was people knew it was gone with the first frost. They didn't know why, but it did. Smallpox didn't do that. Measles didn't do that. Some people were attacked who had no contact with diseased people. We know, at least the last 125 years, it has to do with the Aedes aegypti mosquito and its near relatives. That would be the explanation. They didn't know that. So we have to go back to think about that. What about Webster's authority? Why would anybody listen to him? He wrote, and he knew this was a problem. Though not a physician, I am accustomed to philosophical inquiries, doing research, and presenting data. In fact, he wrote in Brief History, he apologized for his numerous citations, citing many books and page numbers, making his points. So he said it's the question of cause and prevention of yellow fever is resting on primarily on fact, not medical skill, and therefore can be investigated and discussed by any man who has both the leisure and the means, as well as by a physician. And again, recall that Webster didn't really talk about therapy. So his authority, he also had already written 13 books, essays on education, slavery, network. He had a network of correspondence. He lectured, and he had name recognition. And he was also a member of most of the major learned societies. What about publication? He attempted to publish his book by subscription, and that didn't work so well. Rush tried to help, and finally, he had a copy of the manuscript made, and on July 10th, he wrote to a friend, Rufus King, who had been a New York senator. He was ambassador to the court of St. James, to find a bookseller in London to publish his history. And he said, it is my intention not to publish it in this country until it is published in London. I therefore request that it be published in the course of this autumn. When I read that, I said, that's a bit optimistic. From July 10th in New York to get to 3,000 miles, get to New York, find a publisher, have it printed by autumn. And then he said not to publish until it's published in London. He wouldn't publish it here. Well, that came back to bite him. So not having heard from Rufus King, he eventually sent the manuscript to Hudson and Goodwin. It's a printer and publisher in Hartford, at Webster's expense. He had talked with him earlier about the possibility of this. So December 4th, here's is the bill for publishing, for printing 950 copies and binding 50. So that was December 4th. 9 days later, he got a letter from Rufus King saying he sold the manuscript to Mr. Robinson, G.G. Robinson, a major publishing house in London, for 100 guineas. And that was a fair amount of money. I'm not great on this, but it looks like the purchasing power was like something like $19,000 in 2025, if he had gotten that. So there was a London edition. Here's the announcement in the Times of London, April 4th. Webster's copy at New York Public Library. He wasn't happy that the English printer didn't follow his innovative spelling, but he was never paid for it. He had said he wasn't going to publish it here until it was published in London, but he didn't find out that it was published there until later. There was no there was a lot of pirating of books, but I don't think this was that. The first international copyright law was in Bern in 1886, and the U.S. Got involved. That was 1891. Anyway, he wasn't paid for it. What about the reviews? The Medical and Physical Review of London. There's no, the only medical repository is the only medical journal in the United States up until 1804. Webster's book was a comprehensive and elaborate work, diversity of opinions. The British Critic, 1800, that although Webster is not a practitioner in physics, his book is significant importance and should be given consideration of physicians. And the Medical Surgical Review also thought it was eminently great, and that he hopes to overturn prevailing doctrine of contagion from without. Well, but in 1801, British physician John Haygarth, who was interested in particularly smallpox, epidemiology and prevention, he wrote that American pestilence, yellow fever, was a contagious disease and criticized Webster's whimsical and irrational opinions. However, in 1801 review of Haygarth's book, Mitchell and Miller, Smith had already died of yellow fever, they criticized Europeans who, like Haygarth, claimed America as a district of their literary empire and usurped scientific dominion over the minds of Americans who dwell beyond an ocean 3,000 miles wide. I think that was a combination of Hippocrates on air, water, and places, that you really had to know the places, the topography, geography, and also American medical nationalism, which is still an issue. I found this about a dozen years after the New England Journal of Medicine had just started publication. And I found this: America, say the learned editors of the London Medical Review, seems to be a country of epidemics as much as swamps, woods, and savannas. England, we might say in return, is a country of scrofula and consumption as much as it is fogs and vapors. Such observations are at least injudicious, not to say incorrect. So the medical repository reported on it and commends the fervor of the author's zeal, of Webster's zeal, but they had some reservations about some of his opinions. So they did a review, and Miller, I found letters from Miller to Rush. They complained about, Miller complained he didn't really that familiar with modern chemistry. And I might mention, Curry, again, this leading physician to whom he wrote those 25 letters, he wrote, "Till those gentlemen like Webster subject the atmosphere to eudiometric experiments, their theories deserve no more respect than the visionary opinions which prevailed in the dark ages of Gothic ignorance." So here's Curry really dumping on these people for not using the eudiometer. Well, the eudiometer is a glass instrument for measuring, analyzing gases. Fluid and gases. For example, to find that Cavendish and Priestley were using it, and Lavoisier. But the term comes from good air. And so some reformers thought, we should be able to use this instrument to find like marshes and stench, and have scientific evidence that this is bad air. Well, it didn't work. There was standardization problems, and at least 10 years before, it had really gone out. So Curry was behind the times. Charles Brockton Brown criticized Webster's deprecating every object except his own view. The Critical Review in London said they commend his industry, but he's not a medical man. Can't argue about that. Webster's influence on Rush. This is pre-publication of his big book. Rush was probably the leading physician in this country at the time. He had somewhere between 3,000, 3,200 students, and he corresponded with many of them and other physicians. If you're interested, Sarah Narramore's book goes into great detail about Rush's medical letters. And then he published Medical Inquiries and Observations since 1789. And he wrote in March, so this is 9 months before A Brief History is published, I long to see your book in circulation. I have prepared my class consisting of 100 pupils to receive it and read it. And then Webster had sent him a section of the manuscript to read before the book was published. And he said, accept my thanks for the instruction that he gave. The manuscript has arranged my free-floating, half-connected ideas upon the subject of epidemics. Then in Medical Inquiries and Observations, in his book he wrote in 1805 and 1809, he said, I have relinquished my opinion about yellow fever, that it was a contagious disease. He once believed it was a contagious disease. For that change of opinion, I am indebted to Dr. Caldwell and Mr. Webster's publication. So there it is, black and white. So when he finally got the book, when Rush got Webster's Brief History, one of the complaints about the book is it doesn't have any index. Well, not only did he read it, he did a table, not table of contents, index. And here's an index, thanks to Cornelia King at the Library Company of Philadelphia. They redid some of their cataloging. Anyway, and so there it is, the number 73. It talks about during pestilential state of air, the fever in the West Indies, it can assume double malignity and can become contagious if the epidemic constitution is right, as well as the epidemic that's occurring. So this is finally the search for the missing second edition review by the author. I had read everything I could read and about him, the medical aspects. And in going through a bibliography of Webster's writing, 655 pages, I came across these two lines, a note, 2 lines. One of the copies at New York Public Library is Webster's own copy with manuscript corrections and revisions. What? I hadn't seen anything. So I immediately looked in Catnip, the catalog of New York Public Library online. I didn't find it. I had already planned to go to New York Public Library, trek down from Maine to New York. And I said, oh, they may have a different catalogs way to look it up. So I went to Rare Books, and I had a list of things I wanted. And I said to the Rare Books librarian, oh, I can't wait to see this book. And she typed something into says, we don't have that book. And I said, what? And I showed her these 2 lines. And I said, oh, she said, that's interesting. And what she did, there's about 800 volume folios of the catalog cards from 1911 to 1971, the old catalog cards. And in that, there's, I think, 21 on a page. She found it. So it was something, it was lost in the bowels of New York Public Library because it didn't get from the old catalog cards to the electronic catalog. So she found it, brought it to me. Who wrote it? The corrections were in Webster's hands. When did he make the changes? On the verso of the title page, he said, member of the American Philosophical Society. When I checked with him, he became a member in 1827. So presumably it was that he did these corrections after 1827. Why would he consider them after 30 years? My hypothesis was easy to prove. That's when cholera was going through Eastern Europe, Western Europe, and came to the United States and Canada. And this is the Connecticut Herald. There's an advertisement for proposal for publishing a new edition of his 1799 book. The middle is Yale faculty suggesting this be done. And even Daniel Drake, a physician writer and medical educator in Cincinnati and Lexington, suggested that Webster do a new edition. What were the changes? In this review, he mellowed as a reformer. He's now 74, where he wrote, "It is a crime" in 1799, becomes not to be accepted in his revision. The line was actually, but there's a point beyond which ignorance in the medical professors becomes a crime. He changed it, it's not to be accepted. And he deleted the avarice of the original proprietors. He had multitudes of lives are annually sacrificed in cities to the avarice of the original proprietors of lots, excuse me. So that's what he had written at age 41 in 1799. So he's being a little bit more tolerant of his countrymen. In 1858, Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote, "It's a fact most writers get tired of finding fault about the time they begin growing old." So maybe Webster was getting old. Then there was all the in the review changes. He crossed out references to electricity. I mentioned that was in 1800. 30 years later, people weren't really talking about it. John Brown, lunar, he left a lot of things. He crossed them out. But my favorite are the spelling reforms. He's worked on this dictionary for 25 years. It was published in 1828 in New York. And here is typical page. So here's Dictionary Webster correcting his spelling of the book he wrote in 1799. Not really corrections, because most of these were things, innovations that he was trying, that hadn't been accepted by 1832. These were things that were just, they hadn't been accepted. So he was correcting 700 pages he's going through. He's also a little less certain than he was in 1799. So here's his 1828 American Dictionary of the English Language. It was published in London in 1831. They left off the American. I guess they thought it would sell better, the Dictionary of the English Language. And I just want to point out Samuel Johnson, 1755, he had 6 assistants. And James Murray started working on the OED, the Oxford English Dictionary, in 1879. And the first fascicle came out in 1884. But he had, not only his family helped out, but he had many sub-editors, whereas Webster did the whole thing by himself, and he learned 26 languages to read. Conclusions: no new principles of epidemiologic theory. His emphasis was on the factor of epidemic constitution separated him from many of his contemporaries. But summarizing the opinion of the first Sanitary Congress, this is public health, in Paris, 1851, Clobet wrote, "Epidemics are always the results of cosmic conditions." So they're saying by 1850, this has really caught on. And shortly there'll be bacteriology, and this is going to reverse again. Webster hypothesized the chemical properties of the atmosphere were being altered by electrical factors. He deleted that in his revision, as I mentioned. Benjamin Rush and others were clearly influenced by his work. Clean up the cities. Webster advocated for the promotion of systematic collection of disease data by many organizations, including government. He petitioned Congress in 1799 to include character of diseases and duration of life in the census. It did happen, but not for 50 years. So from 1850 to 1885, they were combined. Now they're 2 separate groups doing the census and the mortality statistics. So his 2 books and 25 published letters and other written material represent a major contribution to our understanding of the study of epidemics up to 1800, as interpreted by a non-physician. And I might mention the interface between medical and non-medical authors writing about medical subjects has historically been a porous and contentious boundary. And I might also mention there's also a contentious boundary between professional historians, PhDs in history, and physicians writing about medical history. And I've always tried to, we have things to offer each other, and that we should be working together. It shouldn't be us and they, we and you, and we should be doing it together. In 1836, historian Richard Shryock wrote, "It was his private opinion that when Webster turned to lexicography, he was a good epidemiologist gone wrong." Words and definitions matter to Webster and to us. No, Alexa, I said order lunch, not launch. Thank you, and thank all the librarians and other historians that have helped me through the years. And thank you for your attention.
Let me start by asking if there are any questions. I have a few questions and comments, but I want the audience to have an opportunity first. You describe a couple of interesting things from my point of view. I mean, for those who are, we do have some people who are watching who are not in the medical profession.
Yep.
And so it is, what's this difference between epidemic and contagion? And I think the notion of something being passed person to person versus something you in some way pick up in your location kind of sorts that out. But what you describe here is someone who's got an analytical mind, and there's a chicken and egg problem in that he's, if we think about epidemiology, it's in many ways the business of sorting things out and the business of bunching things together so that you have a sense as to how they relate to each other and which prevails and the like. And to do that, you need a model to be able to say one thing is different from the other, or that two things are the same. And they were lacking those models in those times.
And they were talking, they were a different language. And it's very, to try to make sense out of their terminology 200 years ago it's very difficult. Bilious fever, yellow fever. I mean, they had different names for the same thing, depending on
Right.
what part of the world. It was very complicated. But he was trying to make sense. And looking back, I mentioned presentism, and for the non-historians, that's sort of being not irreligious, but I mean, just it's putting our thoughts, what we know 200 years ago. And why didn't they do this? Why didn't they do? Well, they didn't know. And
Right.
we have to, they weren't stupid. And I like that. I think one of the points about what they were getting at is that this wasn't just like the other contagion. They accepted, I think, they accepted that smallpox was contagious. One person gives it to the other, but it didn't. You had to be near somebody. So if you stayed in a cabin in the woods and didn't meet anybody, you're not going to get that disease. You had to be near somebody. But the vector, whether it's we're talking about the mosquito, female mosquitoes, that made it a little different. And they didn't. It would be 100 years before they really. Well, Carlos Finley, 1870s, 80s, but basically 1900 was when it was proven that you needed the mosquito, and around 1800 people were doing experiments. You'd get a hemorrhagic disease if you didn't get over the acute yellow fever and you were getting worse and worse. You'd start bleeding, intestinally, your skin would start blotching, and it was just different. It was a terrible disease, and it had a relatively high mortality. But there were more. If you look at the data, more people were dying of consumption. I mean, other diseases, endemic diseases, and disease of squalor. And Webster talks about that. And the others, the people. I started to say, in the manuscript that is being reviewed right now, I talked about epidemiology, about what epidemiology is, and trying to understand epidemiology and historical epidemiology, which is what Webster was doing. He wasn't doing research, control studies. That wasn't even done then. But he was just historically trying to make sense out of what he saw in all the different people around the world. There's a lot of post hoc fallacy. It happens after, therefore a cause. So a comet in 1740, and then there was a big epidemic. Is that related? And then there was another kind, and trying to make sense out of, and we still don't really know, do we? I mean, why was 1956, say, a bad year for influenza or whatever, and not 1955, 1957? So anyway.
Well, I think the other thing that I'm picking up here is that physicians, to be accepted as practicing traditional medicine, needed to conform with the theories of the time.
Yeah.
And what we're also seeing is a creative mind here who is essentially challenging. And so he's going to bump up just personality wise against traditional medicine being practiced in those days. I think the other piece I'm picking up from what I hear from you
Rush talked about that too. He said you have to have some imagination to be, if we're going to advance. You can't just do it.
Yeah.
All right, you were going to say something and I interrupted.
And well, the other part here is we don't see the introduction of the scientific method along here. The best we can do is someone coming up with a theory and trying to line up the people they're bunching together and say, does this theory explain it or not? And so you've got conformity versus creative mind. You've got the absence of scientific theory. And then also you're strapped by just what it is you can measure. It's crazy for people to relate things to the weather or to the stars or whatever, but they didn't have a lot in the way of tools to investigate the body. And
I mean, actually, there was something with the weather. I mean, there's
yeah,
things talking about the epidemics having to do with um, uh, um, droughts,
yeah,
hurricane floods, and people would there would be epidemics following them. So it did have to do with to
to a
some
degree.
extent
Yeah.
with weather.
That's the problem also. Is you
A
can
lot of
explain a lot.
variables.
There are a lot of pieces.
A lot of
Um,
variables.
yeah. So, okay. Well, any other questions here? Okay, let's see. Webster's over 50 years ahead of Johnson. Oh, yes.
His residence in Pine Street was 2 blocks away from Pennsylvania Hospital, which was
Yeah.
founded in 1751. I wonder whether that was a source of medical information from physicians because he's so close.
No, you're talking about Webster?
Yeah.
No, he's in New York.
Well, what was
It's not that
Pine
Pine
Street?
Street. There's a Pine Street in probably, but I know what you're talking about.
Oh,
No, he was um it was a block in from Wall Street,
oh, a different Pine Street. Okay.
just behind the city hall is where T and Smith lived. And in my manuscript, I talk about many physicians didn't think that 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 it was transmittable, and they didn't like their patients toted from downtown Manhattan, down, near Wall Street, where most of the population along the river, up to Kips Bay, where the building, that they would, what do you call it? Not a hospital, like an infirmary for people who had yellow fever. That is actually where Bellevue, because Bellevue, that's the site of, but it was so far from where the people lived to have them taken by cart or whatever to sick people from where they were living way out to where Bellevue is now. That's Kips Bay is where they were taking patients to try to recover, but there was a high mortality. People were sick enough. But as I think many of you all know, that early in an epidemic, it was, you didn't want to be the first doctor to say, well, I think it's yellow fever. Oh, we better stop shipping, stop this. Everybody close your shops, leave town. Oh, there was only one case. It wasn't an epidemic. And so people were leery about, as physicians, about, they want to be pretty sure that there's enough cases. And the symptoms, Rush talked about that, the symptoms of yellow fever can be mirrored in many, many other diseases that weren't, he didn't think were yellow fever. So, it wasn't easy. There no specific, immunologic tests and PCRs and well,
But still, he advanced the cause of, in little steps.
Yep.
Medicine was advanced, and so he was able to compile things and put them out there for others to look at and try to frame in one theory or another. And the innovation of a journal that would be reprinted at regular intervals to help communication. So a lot of advances there. Thank you so much for this talk.
Oh, you're very welcome. I enjoyed doing it.
Thank you so much for joining us, and have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.